Hello, and thank you for joining today's Indigenous Connections broadcast. This series of educational videos is focused on Indigenous communities and fostering Indigenous connections. Previous broadcasts have covered topics like celebrating Native American heritage, developing land acknowledgements, co-stewardship, traditional ecological knowledge, and so much more. My name is Catherine Blaylock, and I will be your host for today. I'm a fish and wildlife biologist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center at Shepherdstown, West Virginia. Before moving into our broadcast, I would like to acknowledge that the National Conservation Training Center is located on the unceded ancestral lands of many Indigenous peoples. While we could not find a full account, we are aware that many peoples traversed, cherished, and lived on this land. They include the Massawamek, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware, and we are grateful for them. As we learn more about the Indigenous peoples who continue to have relationships with this land, we better appreciate the good earth on which we work, live, and learn. We pledge to grow and sustain relationships with Indigenous communities through collaboration on our training, outreach, youth programs, museum exhibits, and more. And we encourage you to learn more about the land on which you work and reside. Today, we're going to learn from Paige Schmidt as she presents on departmental policy on the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge and efforts to develop department-wide implementation, guidance, and training. Our broadcast today is titled Elevating Indigenous Knowledge at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Paige works for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Headquarters in Science Applications and the Native American program, where she serves as the Indigenous Knowledge Coordinator. Previously, she spent 12 years as a Zone Biologist for the National Wildlife Refuge System. Throughout her career, she's maintained her passion for elevating the role of Indigenous peoples in the wildlife profession. She's served in numerous leadership positions with the Wildlife Society's Native Peoples Wildlife Management Working Group and focused on increasing the number of Indigenous wildlife biologists. In her current role, she has worked to evaluate how the service provides financial assistance to tribes and represents the service in the development of federal guidance and departmental policy for the consideration and the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in federal activities. Paige is a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation of Oklahoma and resides in Tulsa, Oklahoma with her son. Originally from the Great Lakes region, her tribe signed over 40 treaties, which was forcibly removed multiple times across 100 miles, and eventually purchased their current homelands in Oklahoma. As a result of this history and cultural assimilation policies, such as boarding schools, her family's cultural connection was severed. Her personal journey to reconnect with her tribe and restore traditions for herself and her son drives her passion for her current work. Paige is excited to answer your questions about the new policy on Indigenous knowledge and learn how FWS specific guidance can best meet your needs and issues. So throughout today's broadcast, if you have any questions or things to bring up to Paige, please submit them in today's chat. But thank you, Paige, for your time today. We're really grateful and excited you're here, and I will pass it to you for the presentation.
Thank you for the introduction, Catherine. Let's see if I can manage the screen sharing.
Looks good.
Gotta swap some things on my end. All right, does it still look good?
It looks like it just went away. Okay, looks good.
All right, wonderful, thank you. Bonjour, Mino Gishket, Paige Schmidt and Dejnikaz, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, Indokbia, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Nadeda, Potawatomi, and Dow. So hello and good day. My name is Paige Schmidt, and I was born in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and I now live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I'm a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. So miigwech, or thank you for allowing me to practice my Potawatomi and speak with you today. As Catherine said, I work for the Native American program in Science Applications as the Indigenous Knowledge Coordinator, and I do this work for our headquarters remotely from my home in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which means that I live, work, and play within the recently reaffirmed reservations of the Muskogee Creek Nation and the Cherokee Nation, and also the homelands of the Osage people. My intention for this presentation today is to acknowledge that if we are to center Indigenous knowledge in fulfilling our conservation mission, we must first acknowledge how we gather and use information as a science-based organization and how this influences how we perceive and respond to other knowledge systems. We then must broaden our epistemology of our science-based organization to recognize, value, and elevate other ways of knowing without attempting to validate them against our current methodologies and knowledge base, or by only accepting portions we find consistent with our current methodologies and understanding. I hope to demonstrate this ongoing paradigm shift with efforts to elevate Indigenous knowledge across the government, the Department of the Interior, and then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'll conclude with my hopes for how this work can improve how we fulfill our organizational mission and our trust and other responsibilities to Indigenous peoples. So I'd like to start off with a broad overview of government-wide efforts to elevate Indigenous knowledge. In December of 2022, government-wide guidance for federal departments and agencies on Indigenous knowledge was released at the White House's Tribal Nations Summit. Through release of this guidance, the federal government has recognized the valuable contributions of the Indigenous knowledge that tribal nations and Indigenous peoples have gained and passed down through generations, and the critical importance of ensuring federal departments and agencies' consideration and inclusion of Indigenous knowledge is guided by respect for the sovereignty and self-determination of tribal nations, the nation-to-nation relationship between the United States and tribal nations and our trust responsibility, and the need for the consent of and honest engagement with tribal nations and Indigenous peoples. In conjunction with release of the guidance, the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the Council on Environmental Quality issued an implementation memorandum, which established the National Science and Technology Council Subcommittee on Indigenous Knowledge, which has been meeting regularly. This subcommittee is responsible for implementation of the government-wide guidance. To this end, it has established 5 working groups. Fish and Wildlife Service staff have been involved in 3 of the 5 working groups germane to our mission. It is the hope that continued Fish and Wildlife Service involvement at the level of the Executive Office of the President will serve to build synergy and consistency at all levels of government and serve as a platform to highlight Fish and Wildlife Service specific successes and needs. As an example of this, Sarah Markegard, a Fish and Wildlife Service biologist, presented efforts to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into the species status assessment for the Alexander Archipelago wolf at a full National Science and Technology Council subcommittee meeting on Indigenous knowledge. So now I'd like to narrow the focus to efforts to elevate Indigenous knowledge at the Department of the Interior. I'm sure most of you know that the Department of the Interior protects and manages the nation's natural resources and cultural heritage. It provides scientific and other information about those resources and honors its trust responsibilities or special commitments to American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and affiliated island communities. The department employs approximately 70,000 people across 11 technical bureaus, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So now I'd like to pause for a brief knowledge check. There's no need to do anything. This is just something for you to do on your own. So just take a second and ask yourself if this is a true or false statement. That every Department of the Interior employee has a tribal trust responsibility. I've peppered these throughout the talk so that I can take a quick break to get a drink of water, but also to give you a moment to pause and reflect on your own level of understanding about these issues and how they're interrelated. So I hope that your response to this question was true. All federal employees have responsibility to protect and preserve trust resources for the benefit of tribes. And those include trees, plants, animals, fish, water, wind, minerals, oil, and gas on and off reservation where specified by treaties. Oh, excuse me. The federal government is also charged with managing and distributing the money derived from these resources, or the fiduciary trust responsibility. And the trust responsibility is the umbrella under which we protect all tribal interests. So hopefully that isn't new information to you. In December of 2023, a new policy for the Department of the Interior on Indigenous knowledge was released as a new chapter in the departmental manual. The department manual is a user manual that provides for the organization, function, and authorities of the department and guidance on how to implement requirements. The Indigenous Knowledge Policy was released as 301 Departmental Manual 7, and its purpose is to establish the department's policies, responsibilities, and procedures to respect and equitably promote the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in the department's decision-making, resource management, program implementation, policy development, scientific research, and other actions. So hopefully it's clear that this departmental manual chapter applies broadly to really any activity that the department may undertake. The departmental manual chapter provides several definitions, including Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous peoples, and tribal nations, as well as free, prior, and informed consent. It has a background section that highlights the importance of Indigenous knowledge and provides context for understanding it. The policy is described, which is to respect and promote the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, and it recognizes Indigenous knowledge as one of the many important knowledge systems that contribute to the scientific, technical, social, economic, and political well-being of the United States and to the collective understanding of the natural world. So you can see that this is consistent implementation of the government-wide guidance that was released a year prior. The policy applies to Indigenous peoples, which includes Native Americans, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and Indigenous peoples of the U.S. territories. So it applies more broadly than just federally recognized tribes. The policy recognizes there is no singular term for or definition of Indigenous knowledge, but it provides universal concepts that are generally agreed upon to describe it. Indigenous knowledge is a body of observations, oral and written knowledge, innovations, technologies, practices, and beliefs developed by Indigenous peoples through interaction and experience with the environment. It is applied to phenomena across biological, physical, social, cultural, and spiritual systems, and has been developed over millennia, continues to develop, and includes understanding based on evidence acquired through direct contact with the environment and long-term experiences, as well as extensive observations, lessons, and skills passed from generation to generation. It has been developed, held, and stewarded by Indigenous peoples and is intrinsic within their legal traditions, including customary law or traditional governance structures and decision-making processes. So now let's pause for another knowledge check. True or false? When you're discussing or referencing Indigenous knowledge in official documents, the term Indigenous knowledge should be used. Hopefully you said true to this one as well. Indigenous knowledge goes by many names, including traditional ecological knowledge, native science, Indigenous science, and many others. So Department of the Interior staff should use Indigenous knowledge in agency documents and communications. However, it is appropriate to use the term used or preferred by the tribe or Indigenous community when you're working with them directly. So the next few slides, I'll highlight some of the key items in the policy. As I mentioned previously, it elevates Indigenous knowledge in all activities of the department, including scientific research, resource management, and policymaking. It stresses that to engage with Indigenous knowledge, we must build collaborative relationships with Indigenous peoples built on reciprocity, equity, and mutual respect. We must engage with Indigenous knowledge using appropriate processes and procedures that are developed in collaboration with Indigenous peoples. The policy requires that departmental employees gain free, prior, and informed consent before engaging with or including Indigenous knowledge and the activities of the department. This includes 2 levels of consent from the appropriate governing body and the knowledge holder. Indigenous knowledge must be included in the activities of the department in a manner compliant with federal laws. So for example, it can be considered an aspect of best available science and must comply with the Information Quality Act. The policy requires knowledge holders are compensated for sharing knowledge with the department the same way we would compensate any other consultant. Compensation is not for the knowledge itself in a way that would commodify the knowledge or transfer ownership of that knowledge, but compensates for the time and services provided by the knowledge holder. The policy acknowledges that Indigenous knowledge is inalienable from the knowledge holder. Okay, one more quick knowledge check. True or false? The policy requires that departmental employees gain free, prior, and informed consent from both the knowledge holder and their tribe or appropriate governing body before engaging with or including Indigenous knowledge in the activities of the department. Again, hopefully you said true. Indigenous knowledge is often considered to be communally held as opposed to being held by one individual. Therefore, it is important to ensure that the appropriate governance body is aware of and agrees to a member of their community sharing knowledge with the department and to the intended use of the knowledge being shared. It is also important to work with the appropriate governance body to identify knowledge holders to ensure that the knowledge shared with the department is considered valid by that community. So the next two things from the policy I'll highlight is that it requires departmental employees receive training on engaging with Indigenous knowledge, and it also established a Departmental Indigenous Knowledge Coordination Committee. The Indigenous Knowledge Coordination Committee was stood up in November of last year and is led by Nicole Herman Mercer, a research social scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey as the advisor, and myself and Maria Wiseman as the associate advisor. And Maria works for the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. Members of the Indigenous Knowledge Coordination Committee represent nearly all bureaus and offices of the department and consist of both bureau and office tribal liaisons and subject matter experts. We have a 2-year work plan, which includes developing guidance for bureau and office implementation, specifically the development of a departmental handbook and training, which I'll talk about more next. We also plan to develop resources to assist bureaus as they begin their step-down plans, as well as bureau reporting procedures to measure policy implementation. A further goal of the Indigenous Knowledge Coordination Committee is to facilitate communication and coordination across the department and the government on this topic. So the Fish and Wildlife Service representatives to the Indigenous Knowledge Coordination Committee is George Yaska, the Indigenous Knowledge Liaison for Science Applications in Region 7, or also Alaska. And he is supported by Crystal Leonetti, the Alaska Native Affairs Specialist for Region 7. So how is the department developing this implementation guidance? Last June, the department held a workshop at the Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. It was attended by departmental employees that had been nominated by bureau and office leadership to participate in the development of the implementation guidance. We were also incredibly fortunate to be able to include and fund the participation of 7 external Indigenous knowledge holders and scholars. We had 3 workshop goals. First was to conduct an inclusive meeting, learn from one another, and build relationships. Second was to develop an outline for the Indigenous Knowledge Handbook. And third was to develop a framework for the Indigenous Knowledge Training. To meet the workshop goals, we had a variety of group discussions, presentations, and breakout sessions focused on handbook and training content. The presentations focused on topics we felt would be important to have everyone on the same page about, such as Indigenous data sovereignty, the Freedom of Information Act, free, prior, and informed consent, the role of institutional review boards, and knowledge co-production. At the end of the workshop, we had a plan for departmental training with recommendations on the concepts and methods that the training should include, as well as how the training should be delivered. We also had an extensive outline for the handbook. Both the training framework and the handbook outline were developed collaboratively with our Indigenous knowledge holders and stressed the need to provide implementation guidance differently and the need to include Indigenous perspectives as much as possible. So the draft departmental handbook has 4 sections that help the reader understand what Indigenous knowledge is, the benefits of elevating Indigenous knowledge in our work, and important ethical considerations. The handbook also acknowledges past harms by the federal government and discusses the historical context of the disruption of Indigenous knowledge through detrimental federal policies that included separation from ancestral homelands and land loss, as well as assimilation and the loss of cultural identity. The third section is guided by the process diagram shown on this slide and walks the reader through the various stages associated with the departmental action and the steps one should take along the way when Indigenous knowledge is to be included and applied. The final section is a case study, which is the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in the Alexander Archipelago wolf species status assessment that I mentioned previously. This is included so the reader can see a real-world example of a departmental action stepped through each of these stages from planning to protecting. We have completed internal and external review of the draft handbook and review by the solicitor's office. The internal review included bureau and office leadership, tribal liaisons from across the department, and selected subject matter experts. We've continued to work with our Indigenous subject matter experts and knowledge holders to provide review and feedback of the draft handbook. And we've also undergone an external peer review similar to a journal article review. That process included 5 peer reviewers, 4 of whom are Indigenous and all of whom are practitioners with experience engaging with Indigenous knowledge and their work and lived experiences. We will hold a tribal consultation on this handbook, which is anticipated in September, with anticipated release of the final handbook in fall of 2024. So I mentioned that the policy requires all departmental employees receive training on Indigenous knowledge, but we currently don't have any training. As such, we have a 3-part training plan that came out of the workshop. So the first part is a 1-hour overview training, and the department's training team is collaborating with Indigenous filmmakers to develop this overview training that will consist of a series of short inspirational and informative videos and learning activities. The primary training module will use the voices and perspectives of Indigenous knowledge holders, explaining what Indigenous knowledge is to them in their community. Additional learning activities and modules will include an overview provided by Deputy Solicitor Natalie Landreth on the legal and policy relationship between the United States, the department, and Indigenous peoples, and how this has affected them in their knowledge systems. There's a module on the policy and its requirements, and available or forthcoming resources such as in-depth training I'll talk about next, and the handbook that I just discussed. This overview training will be developed in a virtually deliverable and trackable format in DOI Talent and available to all 70,000 plus departmental employees. We hope to have this available by the end of calendar year 24. The second part of the plan is an in-person, in-depth workshop for departmental employees that engage with Indigenous knowledge as part of their position at the department. The training team is currently working to pilot this experiential workshop that we have designed with Indigenous knowledge holders who are thought leaders, traditional knowledge bearers, and teachers. The workshop will be an immersive, indigenized experience for our employees and will demonstrate how to respectfully implement critical aspects of the handbook and policy. Last, we have proposed a review of all the required departmental training to identify where the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge could be included, such as tensions between Indigenous knowledge and the Freedom of Information Act or open data policies. So there have been many individuals from across the department, including the Fish and Wildlife Service staff highlighted in red, that have been involved in all stages of the development of the policy and the implementation guidance. So now I'll focus on efforts to step down the recent Department of the Interior policy to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So the Indigenous Knowledge, Co-stewardship subteam is a collaborative effort to implement the new departmental chapter and align with the service's co-stewardship implementation work plan goals specific to Indigenous knowledge and provide essential guidance for executing a vital component of the service's Native American policy. I'm going to pause for a second. Did my screen stop sharing the presentation view?
I still see it. Paige looks great.
Great. All right. My computer did the thing I told you about where the monitor disconnects. So apologies for the interruption. So we have a Secretarial Order 3403 and Director's Order 227, which are our co-stewardship policies, which also speak to Indigenous knowledge. So we will also provide essential guidance for executing a vital component of the service's Native American policy that was revised in 2016, which also speaks to working with Indigenous knowledge. So to meet this need for a cadre within the Fish and Wildlife Service with the knowledge, skills, experience, and perspective necessary to elevate Indigenous knowledge in fulfilling our mission, a service-wide call for participation went out, and the Indigenous Knowledge Co-stewardship subteam has approximately 10 individuals from across programs and regions, and we launched in February of this year. Our subteam includes 2 knowledge holders, and everyone on the team is either Indigenous or has direct experience working with Indigenous peoples and their knowledge systems. In addition to the subteam, the service has hired an Indigenous Knowledge Coordinator at headquarters, that is my position, as well as 2 Indigenous Knowledge Liaisons in Alaska. So now for another quick pulse check. And when you think about your work that you do or work that you would like to do, how can you work with Indigenous peoples and their knowledge systems in a respectful and meaningful way? So hopefully the examples that I'm about to provide are consistent with either the ideas or the work that you're doing. So ongoing efforts to elevate Indigenous knowledge throughout the Fish and Wildlife Service include incorporating Indigenous knowledge into species status assessments, such as the Alexander Archipelago wolf, which I mentioned previously, and which was highlighted on this webinar series several months ago, as well as in a recent Journal of Wildlife Management article. There are also current efforts to include Indigenous knowledge in the species status assessment for the Yellowstone bison. Other efforts to include Indigenous knowledge include the Supplemental Environmental Impact Statement for the Coastal Plain Oil and Gas Leasing Program, as well as efforts to include it in co-stewardship and co-management agreements with National Wildlife Refuges, as well as requests for tribal consultation, such as the recent request by the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians for the Everglades Restoration Program and their focus on Indigenous knowledge. The Fish and Wildlife Service is also recognizing limitations in our ability to protect sensitive information and have proposed actions to ameliorate this issue. Lastly, we have several efforts underway to train and communicate our workforce on the new policies and promising practices for work with Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous peoples. And this includes modules on Indigenous knowledge for a new regional Native relations training, this webinar and co-stewardship broadcast that will be available internally. And then also we should mention that the co-chair for the National Science and Technology Council Indigenous Knowledge Community of Practice Learning and Training is from the Fish and Wildlife Service and has been leading those efforts for well over a decade. So this is just a few examples to show that there are opportunities throughout our work with the Fish and Wildlife Service to elevate Indigenous knowledge. Also, to ensure ongoing and future efforts consistently implement recent policy advances, the Indigenous Knowledge Co-Stewardship Subteam is working to identify the programmatic operations that can include Indigenous knowledge and to develop guidance and processes for staff to elevate it in their work. We're also working to craft the necessary leadership messaging and communications to stress the importance of this work in fulfilling our mission and the necessary requirements to ensure our efforts to engage with Indigenous peoples and their knowledges is done in a respectful and meaningful way. So as we broaden our understanding and acceptance of Indigenous knowledge systems, it's important that we carefully consider requirements from the recent departmental policy that might be less familiar to you, but that are consistent with efforts underway in other sectors of the government and non-governmental organizations, and even in international contexts, such as the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So a few highlights are that we should respect Indigenous data sovereignty and recognize there is currently no broadly applicable Freedom of Information Act exemption for Indigenous knowledge. So before initiating any type of Indigenous knowledge project, it's important that you communicate any data protection limitations to the knowledge holder and their tribe or community. And it's also important to consult with the Freedom of Information Act coordinator and legal expert. We also must communicate and work collaboratively to address deficiencies in the processes and structures we have in place to protect sensitive information, should it be made available. It's important to focus on relationships because the policy states we should engage with Indigenous knowledge using appropriate processes and procedures developed in collaboration with Indigenous peoples. This will require meaningful and lasting relationships to develop the trust and open communication needed to identify these processes and procedures. This is critical as every tribe and Indigenous community is unique. Further, the two-level free, prior, and informed consent process does not necessarily follow the structure or protocol associated with traditional aspects of communities and knowledge holders, nor is it prescriptive for what to do if you are working with an Indigenous community that is not a federally recognized tribe. We also need step-down guidance specific to the Fish and Wildlife Service mission and the laws we are responsible for implementing. We must develop support and capacity to develop the necessary processes to elevate and protect Indigenous knowledge when it's made available. This includes engaging tribes and Indigenous communities much earlier than we are accustomed to doing. So I'd like to end by sharing a quote from a recent publication by Joseph Gazing-Wolf et al. It was in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. Because Indigenous knowledges are embodied in the cultures, ecological relationality, and presence of Indigenous peoples, any effective attempt at the centering of Indigenous knowledges within settler colonial institutions requires systemic change in the culture, values, protocols, and leadership that constitute settler colonial institution. Finally, I would like to echo perspectives that was recently shared by the Indigenous Knowledge Coordination Committee advisor, Nicole Harmon Mercer. Her words exemplify how we need to make space to center Indigenous knowledge. She stated that moving forward, as we seek to increase our engagement with knowledge holders and application of Indigenous knowledge, we should focus on relationships, time, and a new paradigm. We need to move away from thinking of Indigenous knowledge as another data set with which we can develop a one-to-one relationship with Western scientific data. Instead, we need to prioritize co-management and co-stewardship, co-decision-making, and co-production of knowledge so that we can capitalize on the strengths of each way of knowing without subsuming one into the other. It is my hope that this presentation today demonstrates how the Fish and Wildlife Service is shifting our paradigm to fulfill our trust and other responsibilities to Indigenous peoples and to elevate Indigenous knowledge throughout our work. With that, I would like to say miigwech, or thank you all for attending and the opportunity to present today. It has been an honor and privilege to take part in this work, and I look forward to continue supporting implementation of the policy, guidance, and training at all levels of government. I also want to acknowledge all of the collaborators who have worked on the policy handbook and training development, especially our Indigenous partners who continue to guide this work and offer their time and knowledge. I also want to acknowledge all of the people at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service who are working to step this down throughout our work, and have been doing so for many, many years. I am the person presenting today, but I'm presenting the outcomes of truly collaborative efforts. Our work continues, and I look forward to seeing ongoing progress. So with that, I will turn it back over to Catherine, and I'll take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Paige, for sharing your time with us today. We truly appreciate you sharing your work and your expertise. I love seeing the examples of the many opportunities that the Fish and Wildlife Service has to elevate Indigenous knowledge. The ones that are particular to my mind are the training, the communications. So that's really exciting. Thank you for all the great information. So a couple of questions just to start it off. And if you have others, please put them in the chat for Paige for a quick Q&A. But one of the questions is, do you need to wait for a formal consultation request in order to initiate discussion of Indigenous knowledge?
Definitely not. So I definitely think that we need to start engaging sooner and not wait for a tribe to request formal consultation on an activity or a decision that we have taken. If you have something that is in the works that you can see, you don't need to wait for the clock to start to reach out and to start engaging, because many of these processes are going to take a lot longer than we're used to. It's not like somebody has an Excel spreadsheet on their computer and you can send a Dear Tribal Leader letter and ask for Indigenous knowledge and they're going to email it to you. It doesn't work like that. There's a little bit more to it. And so we need to prepare for that in our budgeting and our planning processes. And the forthcoming handbook offers recommendations for how to do that.
Yeah, thank you. This is kind of just a random one. What's been a highlight from just working on the co-stewardship sub-team? What does that look like?
Getting to know all the people on the team and the amazing work that we do. We oftentimes are so busy that we don't have a chance to look up and look around and to see all of the amazing work already being done. And a lot of this work was started, for example, the Alexander Archipelago Wolf Species Status Assessment started before the White House guidance was released and before the department policy was available. And the handbook is still not available for staff, yet they still had the courage to do it, and they did it well. It wasn't perfect. There were lessons learned, and they have been sharing those lessons broadly so that everybody can learn and we can all do better moving forward. So I think that just seeing people's passion for this work and their innovation is truly been the highlight of working on the Indigenous Knowledge Co-stewardship sub-team.
Yeah, thank you. I can tell you're passionate about it. It's definitely exciting work. I can't wait to see the handbook myself and take some training when it becomes available. Another question is, how long do you recommend for an Indigenous knowledge project, similar to the case study of the wolf species status assessment that you brought up?
So they had about 1 year to do it, and they recommend 2 to 3 years because presumably if nothing has been documented, that's assuming that you have a relationship in place. If you don't have a relationship in place, you have to start there and building that relationship and building the trust and identifying what the tribe or Indigenous community's priorities and interests are and where they might want to share Indigenous knowledge and where that intersects with Fish and Wildlife Service activities. So I think that it really kind of depends on the specific project or activity and the nature of the relationship that may be in place or that may need to be developed.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. It takes a long time to build relationships.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Well, there's no other questions in the chat. So I guess I'll go ahead and close it out. Thank you everybody for joining, and thank you again, Paige, just for sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us. We hope you all can join us next month on August 21st at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for our next Indigenous Connections broadcast. As a reminder, each broadcast is recorded and available on NCTC's website. So if you wish to learn more about this broadcast series or to be added to our listserv, please email Jennifer Hill at jennifer_hill@fws.gov. And we always welcome your broadcast suggestions. But thank you again for joining today.
Thank you for having me, Catherine.
It's a pleasure.